equitable and excellent education system in the Commonwealth. Our first guest in the series is Shay Edmond, who is the Senior Associate Commissioner for the Center for Strategic Initiatives at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, also known as Desis. The center coordinates and partners with both internal and external stakeholders to identify, design, pilot, and elevate strategies that advance educational equity for Massachusetts students, particularly those traditionally or currently underserved. As Senior Associate Commissioner, Shay is responsible for leading Desis' diverse and culturally responsive Massachusetts educators workforce priority, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and practices within Desis, and district-level programs that promote equitable student access to opportunities and outcomes. Shay also provides programmatic and fiscal oversight of the Metropolitan Council for Educational Opportunity, also known as METCO program, and supports the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education's Racial Imbalance and Gifted and Talented Councils, Advisory Councils. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Commissioner Edmond. In your bio just now, I read the mission of the Center for Strategic Initiatives, which again is to elevate strategies that advance education equity for Massachusetts students. That aligns with our goals at E4E Boston too, so I really enjoyed hearing that. Can you tell me about one of the center's strategies in particular that you're excited about and what impact it's already either already having or will have for our students?
Thank you so much, Lisa, for the gracious invitation and for allowing me to be the first to take part in your series of conversations, which is incredibly important to ensure that everyone, particularly our educators and teachers, have the access to the information they need. And so thank you again for the opportunity. And so as it relates to one of the areas that I'm most excited about, that would be our agency's priority, as you read in my bio, around creating a more diverse and culturally responsive Massachusetts educator workforce. And so it's an incredibly tall order, but one that Commissioner Riley has been very clear and steadfast in since he arrived at the department about 4 years ago. And so in the 4 years since we've really worked in earnest around this priority, we have developed a theory of action. We have created a strategic plan, which really lays out the, I would say, roadmap for us internally at Desis to ensure that we are addressing the various, I would say, challenges and barriers that exist for getting folks of color into the profession, and then also addressing the climates that students of color as well as educators of color find themselves in. And so I'll pause here for a little bit, but this is an area that I continue to be just energized about and excited about because it has so many implications for the students who we've all collectively agreed to serve.
Thank you for sharing that, Shay. That is very exciting information. And we also know that it's crucial for students of color to be able to see themselves, like you said, in their teachers. And relatedly, it's important for them to be able to see themselves in their curriculum. Many of our educators are currently supporting legislation at the State House that would ensure statewide frameworks would be more inclusive and anti-racist. And how can those folks work with Desis to implement a racially and culturally inclusive curriculum?
Yeah, and I really appreciate that question. And I think before I address your question, I think it would be helpful for the audience to just kind of hear a little bit more about the way in which Desis has developed this strategic approach to create a more diverse and culturally responsive educator workforce. As I often say in conversations and panels and working with schools and districts, the notion of having a diverse and culturally responsive educator workforce, it's not one and the same, right? And so recognizing that we need to have a multifaceted approach, what we've done in the Commonwealth is create, as I mentioned a short while ago, a strategy that really gets at the barriers that we know to be true both in Massachusetts as well as nationwide. So we know that there are real financial barriers for people of color to entering the profession. We know that there are, I would say, notions or ideas or even beliefs around the fact that there might be better financial opportunities in other sectors, right? And so education doesn't necessarily become the profession of choice. And then finally, and I would say, and continue to argue, most importantly, is that we know students of color and educators of color are having different experiences in schools and districts. And so when we specifically isolate the student experience, we know that it's incredibly important to develop a strategy that not only talks to or addresses the financial barriers and the fact that we understand that folks might think that there are other financial opportunities, but really addressing the experiences of our students in the here and now, because ultimately the students that are sitting day in and day out in our classrooms around this Commonwealth are our future teaching workforce. And we need to ensure that education becomes the profession of choice for them. And we need to ensure rather for students of color in particular, that should they choose to enter the workforce, it's not a narrative that's one of in spite of my experience, but really shifting it to that of because of my experiences as a student in K-12. I have chose this profession as a profession of choice. And so within our strategy, we have provided at this point approximately $9 million we've awarded to schools and districts to really either develop or enhance existing teacher recruitment and retention programs with an explicit focus on educator diversification. We provide high quality, sustained, impactful professional development, year-long series. Right now we're supporting 100 LEAs, as we call it. What that means is schools and districts across all school types, which means charter, traditional, voc tech, and approved private special education schools, to really address the culturally responsive piece, right? Because we know that conditions in schools and districts have to be conducive to not only recruiting the educators that we're working so hard to bring into the profession, but to also retain the few that we have now and be able to build upon that. And so when we think about what does it take in terms of really reaching our goal, which at the state level is 26% educators of color by 2030, we know that we have to look across all of these areas because they all impact each other. To your specific question around the curriculum and the anti-racism component of it, and I think, Lisa, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think you asked how educators can implement these practices in their classrooms, and if not, moving the bill forward. I think that it's incredibly important for students and educators to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. So as important as it is for our students, it's also important for the educators that are charged with the incredibly Herculean task of teaching. It is the hardest profession that exists. And so educators that are currently working in our classrooms can certainly work with their legislatures, but there are also opportunities in the here and now by way of resources that we have at Desi that really can support educators in understanding what culturally responsive teaching and learning looks like, and how to infuse those practices in their day-to-day instruction of students. And happy to talk about that a little bit more. But I will say, from what we know at the department around the anti-racism bill that is being discussed, and we don't get involved too much in bill or in legislation, but what we understand is really at the heart of it is that people want to ensure that they are reflected in the curriculum. And Desi has made those steps and taken those steps to really put culturally responsive teaching and leading at the forefront. In addition to the professional learning community I mentioned, we have academies, year-long academies that are explicitly focused on culturally responsive teaching, culturally responsive leading. And so we have worked over the last, I'd say, 4 years or so in a very concerted way to ensure that we have resources that are available not only for our teachers, but also for administrators across all levels of a school or district, such that they are able to support their staff. But ultimately, right, this is about the kids that we're all serving and to better support students.
No, thank you for that really thorough response. And as a former chemistry educator myself, I did not realize the multitude of resources that I had at my disposal. And so I know many educators listening may be unaware of the various resources DESI has to support them as they seek to provide more equity and inclusion in their classrooms. And I know you touched upon this just a little bit. So, what are some of the resources and tools that DESI provides, and how can our educators best access and implement them?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to what I opened my remarks with around having access to information. That is so key and critical, right? Because a lot of the work has been done, but sometimes a lot of educators, including the educators that I have the fortunate experience of engaging with, don't always know that these resources exist. So they find themselves having to create them on their own, and there's just not enough time in the day for that, right? And so I would say probably the best place, because there's more than one location on DESI's website, but the best place for educators to go to access the resources that we have as it specifically relates to culturally responsive teaching and learning would be in our Center for Instructional Support on their website, and happy to provide that to you after this conversation, Lisa, such that you can then share it with your network. But if you go in the Center for Instructional Support, you'll find a whole suite of resources that directly relate to instruction. And specifically embedded within that, educators would be able to find a section on culturally responsive teaching and
Mm-hmm.
leading. And then there are resources for classrooms, there are tips, there are videos for educators to watch. It's one thing sometimes to read a resource, and it's another
Mm-hmm.
to be able to see it in practice, so teachers can understand this is what it looks like in practice. And there are even resources around what culturally responsive teaching looks like within specific content areas. And so when educators or teachers go to the website, they'll be able to see videos and examples of what this might look like in ELA, or what it might look like in math.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to the very specific section on culturally responsive leading and teaching, we also have Curate, which are high quality instructional materials that educators, and I say that broadly across the board,
Mm-hmm.
have access to, but I would say more specifically would be of interest to teachers, such that they're able to get access to high quality curricula across all content areas that infuse equity, and hopefully be able to implement them in their classrooms as they see fit.
Oh, Shay, thank you so much for just giving us more insight into how to tap into a ton of the resources that are already in play. And it's also really great to know that DESI is already thinking really intentionally about this, and really thinking about how we can move this forward. Um, I also want to name that when we knew we were talking to you, we had a few questions that came up from our educators. And so I'd just like to open it up for our educator questions. And so one of the first questions our educators were really interested in understanding is, what is the best way to partner with DESI to make changes? If I'm an educator in the classroom, what can I do?
Yeah, and I think that that is a great question. And it's not always the easiest to answer, because DESI is a large state agency organization that is comprised of many different centers, like mine, and offices. And so, what we've done, I think, very well over the last several years is really make opportunities specifically designed for teachers, and then opportunities that really seek the unique perspectives of teachers of color. We have included information in our commissioner's weekly update that goes out to tens of thousands of
Mm,
not only educators, but just individuals, constituents around, or sorry, I should say, sorry, across the Commonwealth that are interested in education and education policy. And so we oftentimes include ways for educators to get involved there, depending upon the initiative or the program or the reason for the outreach. Specific centers might reach out directly to specific schools and districts, or kind of do an all call, if you will, for districts to share opportunities with their educators, as they're able. And so there are a number of ways. We're getting better, I think, at messaging and making sure that, again, at the end of the day, people have access to information. And so we are always pushing the information out, and it comes out from, again, all of the various centers and offices that we have. I would say in the inverse, if there's an educator that is interested in learning more about what it is that we do at Desi, or learn more about ways in which teachers can get involved, then I always just invite people to email me. Because then I'm able to better assess and understand what is it that you're seeking, what is it that you're looking for, so that I could then direct that individual to the appropriate place, right? Because at the end of the day, this is about access to information, access to resources. And so when in doubt, I always make myself available. And if someone has a question, my email, my cell phone number is always out there for people to get in touch. And I really like that educators actually do that, right? Both teachers and administrators. I have found that it's really important for educators, particularly though educators of color, to really build their network. And that starts by having access to information. And so as much as I'm able to support folks, I do what I can. And so those would, I would say, be the two ways. Obviously, I'm not the only person at Desi. If teachers or administrators know of other people at Desi that they've worked with, or maybe just come across maybe at a professional development series or session, to reach out. I really think that under Commissioner Riley's leadership, Desi has become incredibly responsive to educators and really shifted the narrative from one of strictly accountability to the state being a partner. And that is one of the pillars in Commissioner Riley's Our Way Forward, which really lays out the roadmap for the next phase of public education in the Commonwealth. So,
Wow.
that
is, no, that was an excellent answer, Shay. Just even talking about opening of resources and information, but access to people is also so critical in being able to make these decisions for yourselves, and for educators who want to partner, as you named. Desi is a huge institution, and there's so many amazing initiatives that are happening throughout. On our end, we can definitely work on tapping educators into any of the programs and initiatives coming out of Desi to make sure that they're more well connected, and continuing conversations like these where we elevate what other opportunities that are available within the Commonwealth to our educators. And our last question from the audience is, do you think we will ever achieve the level of educator diversity our schools need?
That's another good one. And my answer is yes, I do, right? And so earlier in my comments, I noted that our state goal is to have 26% educators of color by 2030. And so that percentage wasn't, we didn't just create it. It was based upon research, the workforce research and data, specifically of the Commonwealth. And so 26% is what actually brings us to parity with our students, with our student population. And so I do think we'll achieve it. But ultimately, as I've said before, I don't know that that is, or I don't know that I believe that that's the end goal, right? The end goal at the end of the day is creating environments and spaces and buildings where our students, particularly students of color, feel as though they can be themselves, they can be authentic, they can thrive, right? And folks can see their genius and their ability. And so this is more about this mission, as I see it, which again, Commissioner Riley has been incredibly unapologetic about. It's more about just getting people of color into the profession. We need to do that, but we also need to address the environments in which our students are engaging within. And so, as I said before, having a diverse workforce and working strategically toward that is one part of it. And the other part of it is working with the educators that we have right now, irrespective of their race or ethnicity, to ensure that they are delivering instruction that meets the needs of students, that is culturally responsive, that understands students' cultures and their attributes and all that they bring right to the table. And so it's a dual priority, if you will. And so while I certainly believe that we can reach our goal of 26% by 2030, I also know that that is not the end goal, and we have continued work to do as it relates to creating the conditions and environments that are, that allow our students and ultimately our educators to thrive within.
Oh, well, thank you, Shay. You shared just so much, quite frankly, that last piece was just like hope and inspiration for what the future will look like for us. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our educators and our audience? I know we just barely got to scratch the tip of the iceberg of all of the work and impact that you have within the Commonwealth.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Lisa. I think I would just echo again my note of gratitude again for the gracious invitation to invite me on and to talk about this. This is, there's work and then there are callings and then there are professions that really kind of feed the soul. And for me, as crazy as it might seem, working in a state education agency, this is that. I get up every day and do what I do because our students, again, who I truly believe we've all collectively agreed to serve, are that North Star. And so just the notion or idea that what we're doing at Desis might have opportunity, I'd say, to impact them, even if it's a small impact, but if they're able to do that, it's a blessing. And I'm truly appreciative. So thank you for just allowing the space so I could talk about some of the work that Desi's done. We're proud of it. In the last 3 years, across all metrics, recruitment and retention, across all job classifications, across all races and ethnicities, we have seen increases over the last 3 years. And so that tells us that we are on the right track. And just continues to remind us that there's a lot more work ahead. But we are pleased with the progress that we're seeing to date. And we know that it, at the end of the day, is because of the hard work of organizations like E4E, as well as our schools and districts. So we thank you all for the partnership.
Ah. Well, Shay, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I appreciate the work that you are doing to support the needs of our educators, students, and families. And quite frankly, your leadership inspires me. And I would also like to thank our audience for listening today. And we have a lot of exciting opportunities for engagement if you want to learn more about E4E or Shay and the work that she's doing in Desis. Please, you can keep up with all the rest of our upcoming events at e4e.org/events. Our next event in this conversation series will be on March 22nd with Dr. Mariel Novas, an education advocate who most recently served as the mayor of Boston, mayor of Boston's Michelle Wu's transition director. And we're also holding a rally for inclusive curriculum legislation outside the Massachusetts State House on Monday, February 28th at 5 p.m. To get more information and to RSVP for that, again, you can go to e4e.org/events. Thank you for joining in with us today.